Okay, so part two, on Lévi-Strauss, 16th of September, morning class. We're now talking, hi, all right? Hello. So last year the class told me about this story, and I think I need a bit more detail, but trick might be, or the thing to do might be, to try and see if we can make more sense of this story using some ideas from Lévi-Strauss. The structural ideas. So the first thing to do is to gather our ethnographic material and gathering the story from you. Is there any part of this story that I've forgotten? All right. First of all, here's the story. The story is about an immortal being, right, lives forever, who stands for the desire to have freedom in the time of the Hong Kings. In that time, there was a woman who went out and saw some big footprints, and then she got pregnant. Again, that's not how you get pregnant, but by the way. She gave birth to a child named Gyong. Gyong? Pronunciation okay? All right. Then invaders from China come. The king needs heroes and came through the village, and the child asked the mother for a steel horse, saddle, and whip. He will fight the enemy. After that, he decided to fight for freedom, and the village got food for him, and he grows. The whip is broken, and afterwards he returns to the sky. Are there any parts of the story I've missed? How well do you remember the story? Is that the basic story? Anything else? So Lévi-Strauss, if there's nothing else, this is what we have to go on. There probably are very many variations of this story, and there's probably some other details, but we can go on this one. What we have to do is work out, what did he tell us to do? Work out the armature of the myths, look at the oppositions and the relationship, forms and the relationship. Okay? So, first of all, what are the oppositions? Sky, where the immortal lives, immortal, and village, where the woman lives, and the woman gives birth in the village. What else? This is in the time of the Hung Kings. So we have kings. That's my idea of a king. Kings wear silly hats, okay? In that time, there was a woman who went out and saw big footprints. Okay, she saw big footprints. And then she got pregnant. Oh dear, what's this? How did that happen? Right, she doesn't know. She just saw a footprint, then she was a bit pregnant. Oh, I don't know what happened. Somebody put something in her drink, right? Oh dear. No, this is not good. You should not do that. This is terrible. But anyway. And she gave birth to a child named Gyong. Mama. Oh, he's got 3 arms. Okay. Then the kings, next page. Invaders from China come. China sends invaders to the village, and the kings want to come and get heroes. They pass through the village, and the child wants a horse, a saddle, and a whip. A saddle, a horse, and a... What does a whip look like? I don't know what a whip looked like. Okay, he wants a saddle, a horse, and a whip, and he will fight the enemy. So she's not there anymore, but he will fight the China. Okay, fight the enemy. He decides to fight for freedom, and the village gave him food. The village gave him food, and he grows strong muscles, right? And so he can fight the enemy. The village gives him food. I don't understand this part of the story. The whip is broken. How does that happen? How did the whip get broken? Okay. And where did he get the whip from? Okay, now I understand more. So the king wants to fight China, right? But the king then uses this boy who is really from the gods. The villagers give him food. The king gives him a whip. But the whip breaks. The whip breaks. That's why the whip is important. It breaks, and the boy uses bamboo. 1 stick of bamboo can break easy. 10 sticks of bamboo, you cannot break. If all the villagers have bamboo, you cannot defeat them. If just one king has just one whip, even if that king can use an immortal, it cannot defeat China. The only defeat can come is if the village give food to the youth, to the young, build up the young so they are strong, and they use the resources of the village, bamboo, not the resources from the king. Don't be a soldier, don't be a fool for the king. So somehow like, don't go there, because that will be some kind of imaginary thing. Rely on what is in the village. This woman though, why did she see the footprint? She saw the footprint of the immortal God. So she says, but we know that that's not how you have children. You don't get pregnant from seeing a footprint. Takes a bit more. So this story really is saying village good, king bad. No, not bad. Not so helpful. If the village relies on itself and brings the immortal down to earth, it can defeat the China. If the village relies on the king and the immortal, it cannot defeat China. The whip will break. So you need food, bamboo, and believe in the spirit of the people, not the spirit of some king or God. I think it makes sense. You understand it as a propaganda story. It can be used for that, right? I'm sure that if we could get more details to the story, there must be other things that I'm missing. We can do this even more and more. The thing is, you can read what you want into the story. What we should do now is try and read the story in a way that is different to that interpretation. Can we do that? I'm not sure I can. I guess I would read it differently. I would say, this woman, she goes out of the village. When she goes out of the village, she starts to believe in imaginary beings. She sees a footprint and gets pregnant. That's not good rational thinking. What she should have done is not rely on magical thinking, but build up the kid with food and bamboo, which is a symbol of the village. The bamboo, I suppose, comes from the village, right? Don't rely on the immortal. Don't rely on the God. The strength of the boy is not from being immortal, it's from getting food and using the resources of the village. That's not really a different interpretation. That's the same thing, propaganda. But yeah, this is what these stories are for. Lévi-Strauss will say that you should do work in one particular culture area, but in his life over a period of 1960 to, he died as 101 years old about 4 or 5 years ago. So in his life, he studied from the 60s, from the 1960s till his death, but publishing until the 1990s. He studied South American myths. And his major work is a series of 4 volumes called the Mythologiques. And the Mythologiques is the myths of this whole of the South American and North American continent. The Bororo are there in the Amazon. But he starts to pick up other myths. In these books, the Mythologiques, the 4 volumes, each one this big, he follows a certain myth from community to community. He gets the records. He collects over 30 years so many records of myths collected by many other people and studies and follows. In the first volume, it's called The Raw and the Cooked. And it's the stories that tell about how humans got fire to be able to cook food. And you can see that the story about how you get food and get fire for cooking mediates through the opposition between raw food, like uncooked food, and burnt things, too much cooked. But not enough cooked and too much cooked. What humans have to do is pass through the middle way. Okay, but they do that with some things that are able to mediate that opposition. So in the second volume, he picks up a whole lot of myths that start, it's called From Honey to Ashes. Start with the opposition of raw food, not cooked enough, and ashes that are cooked too much, charred black things, and recognize that some foods that are uncooked are really good. Honey. You can't cook it, right? Honey is a food that is not raw. Well, it's raw, but it's already ready. And ashes, some things you can use in ashes. Tobacco smoke. Tobacco is best if you smoke it. You turn it to ashes and it's a good thing. I mean, yes, smoking is bad. I'm not saying you should start smoking. Who cares about that, really? But for them, these two extremes emphasize the contradictions in the myths that negotiate between raw and cooked. Then in the third volume, he travels a bit further into Central America, I think, or the Venezuela, this area further north. And the book is called The Origin of Table Manners. And it's about how in the stories, jaguar or some other totem animal learns how to steal fire and make food in a systematic way, and to look after that food, to have pots to contain that food, and to distribute the food correctly, to have table manners. And then in the final volume, he goes into North America, the American Indian, or the Native American, or whatever you call them nowadays. And there, the volume is called The Naked Man, and that finishes the trilogy, the quadrilogy, the 4 books. The naked man is a figure that moves through the stories and is the one who, right, he's naked, but he's got to learn table manners or dressing. He's not got fire, but he's got to learn to cook. It's about becoming human. All the things that the naked man has to do, has to learn is culture. And how does that man learn culture? By negotiating through the complex of too raw or too burnt, or the contradictions of honey, which is still raw but is okay, and tobacco, which is still burnt but is okay. So some things that are burnt are good. Being able to make subtle distinctions and to understand opposition. So this mythological world, these are stories, right? And they tell the myths. You can leave if you really need to, but otherwise you listen and read and translated it. All right, so it's a mythical world. The mythological world is a time. It's not this time. It's not the far past. It's a mythological past. A time when jaguars were kind of like people. They were beings that did things like stole fire and so on. Now, how the world became what it is today, animals stopped being like people, or people stopped being like animals. All right? But these stories from this world with imaginary time, humans, animals, and plants were all living in one system. They live together. I mean, they still do, but people somehow are now separate. So they tell stories of the time where these things were still emergent. So the myths tell stories about how the moon came into being. The moon as the child of the sun and things like that. So a man called Maurice Godelier, a French anthropologist, has written a wonderful book on Lévi-Strauss, who died as 101 just a few years ago, celebrating this but also making some criticism. I want to go through this criticism. First of all, he questions this idea of mythical time. The time of the origin of the sun, of the moon. Myths have to tell stories that explain things that we don't have explanations for. We don't know how the sun came into being. I mean, we have science now that tells us there was a big explosion. You can read it out if you want. In tiếng Việt, see if the translation is good enough. So myths are amazing because myths can explain everything. They explain everything from the moon to bits of the body and why they are there and why they are dangerous. Why they might have, I don't know, animal qualities. Right? So Lévi-Strauss is very exciting because he grapples with these issues. He takes these issues up and out of his mind has come the possibility of understanding how a whole hemisphere of people have thought about the world. So in these 4 volumes, there's 2,000 pages. There are 813 myths from North and South America, and some from elsewhere for comparative purposes, from China and Japan. A few from ancient Greece, Rome, and Europe. They cover 350 tribes. So here, for sure, Lévi-Strauss is not doing what Evans Pritchard was doing last year, like one tribe. Here's 350. You can't go and have a look for yourself in this context. What he's had a look for himself is the stories that people have collected. And it's somehow like it's a record. It's an encyclopedia of what thought there was about the natural world before science. He collected that. So, you know, that's a impressive project. He lists in these myths, the myths tell us how to do things. They have different techniques, how to fish, how to hunt, how to paint, how to draw, how to write. First of all, right, to write, somebody must make a stick. The stick then has to be burnt at the end and charcoal made so you can draw on bark. That just didn't happen. There has to be a story that explains how writing began. Right? Because they do understand writing. And there are lots of diagrams and old engravings, maps. So it's an amazing compendium of ethnographic detail. And with fantastic stories, like the one I got you to read about the writing lesson. So Godelier wants to say, these are exceptional in every way. It's an amazing project. One man, okay, he had some research assistants to help him. This is in the days before computers, right? 1960s, 1970s. He wasn't doing it online or anything. He's doing it with paper cards, covering 350 people, 800 and something myths to work out all the different oppositions and hold them together. And then each of them has this little story, like the writing lesson. How many of you read the story of the writing lesson? Just one? You have to do the reading. It's not going to make sense if I talk about it without you having done the reading. The writing lesson about the emergence of writing in a tribal group, the Bororo, where he goes to visit. And the head of the Bororo uses writing, even though he doesn't understand what the words mean, he understands the meaning of writing. Right? Can I borrow your pen and paper? He sees the anthropologist writing, and so when the anthropologist is going to give gifts out, they're about to leave the village, he's going to give out gifts. The chief takes the pen and paper and pretends to write and to read and say, ah, yes, this necklace is for you. Ah, yes, it's for you. He's not writing, he's just pretending to write. He understood the meaning of writing. Writing is about power, about control of things. You use writing to control things in the world. Lévi-Strauss says, at least, that these were people without writing. There's a question for you. Were they a people without writing? They understood that the anthropologist, when he used his stick and paper, that would determine who would get which present. They understood the politics of distribution and using writing to control who would get what. So were these people a people without writing? If they knew about distribution of things? Jacques Derrida will say, no, they had a kind of proto-writing. And in fact, their idea of who got what distribution was already marked out by making diagrams on the face. The tattoos on their face. Instead of writing in books, they had written their meanings in their tattoos. But of course, that's not accessible to Lévi-Strauss because he didn't learn the language. And you know, the question of what is the origin of writing is a question for Lévi-Strauss, not a question for the Bororo. They don't ask that question. Yes, they can take advantage of it because they understand they have a politics. They're like from the village. The anthropologist is from the king or from the immortal. So that's really interesting that even at the point of most engaging stories, it's the anthropologist's interests that are projected onto that material. What would a Bororo anthropologist say? We don't know. But that's where what's interesting later on, in the next weeks, we will see where anthropology becomes more and more localized. We've got Vietnamese anthropologists, we've got Indian anthropologists, and so on and so forth. Godelier makes a critique, though. See, the thing is, Godelier says, what do the Indians hear when they listen to their myths? Not what does the anthropologist hear. The anthropologist hears all these oppositions and so on. What do the Indians hear? Not just the story, why women have periods or why the moon has spots. What they're listening to is what they hear through the images is a discourse about solving their problems. Lévi-Strauss says these stories don't have rhyme or reason. Why would a prince kiss a dead person, for example? But the reason for that is to make the story work, to make the logic of the story tell us that jealousy is bad, working with the downtrodden is good. Maybe, if that's what Snow White was really about. Now, Godelier raises some problems. He says this structure ignores a special power of the sacred. What is the sacred? I'm skeptical. But if people accept the divine order, well, you don't need to, if people accept that the gods will intervene on earth, you don't need structural analysis to kind of explain that. People understand it. He has some other critiques of Lévi-Strauss. Here he is in his library. For Lévi-Strauss, the myths, you need to, they are constituting local and temporary answers to problems, right? Raised by issue. What is the answer to the problem? The problem is, how do we defeat China? Do we rely on the king to defeat China? No, even the king relies on the people. The people should rely on the village, on the bamboo, on the food, right? So it's a message in the myth. Don't rely on the king, don't rely on the sky god. The resource is in the village. The content of the myth endows itself is not anterior but posterior to this impulse. Wow. So this is a quote from the last chapter, The Naked Man, translated, just to show you how difficult Lévi-Strauss is, okay? The myths should be seen as constituting local and temporary answers to the problems raised by feasible adjustments in soluble contradictions that are endeavoring to legitimize or conceal. Well, if a myth is trying to justify something or conceal it, I mean, how do you decide which is which? The content with which the myth endows itself is not anterior but posterior to this initial impulse, which is the initial impulse of solving the problem. Far from deriving from one content or another, the myth moves towards a particular content through the attraction of its specific gravity. I don't even know what that means. In each individual case, it alienates in the process part of its apparent liberty, which, looked from another angle, is no more than an aspect of its own necessity. All right, let me tell you that in that last part, what I think is happening is that somehow there's a necessity of understanding pregnancy. How do we understand that a woman sees some footprints and then becomes pregnant? Was that divine intervention? You think that the sky god has made her pregnant, like, you know, Jesus in the chamber? No, Mary gives birth to Jesus without Joseph having done anything. That's a contradiction and a liberty. The story makes this jump. But what really is happening in the movement is this thing about the China and the village being the resource. Rely on your own resources, not on the sky god to get pregnant. Don't use footprints, use a man. The myth doesn't go there, but it tells something else. I think that's a necessity. That's the necessity that Lévi-Strauss is talking about here. The thing is, his structural analysis is nuanced and complicated. So very difficult, and he really gets into it. Like, he's into structural patterns. Look at his jacket even. And it's insane. This is when he got the special medal from the president of France. But Godelier says his formulas are fantastic and provocative, but they don't make any sense. They literally do not make sense. How can the sky god make a woman pregnant and that tell you that you should rely on your own resources? That's just made up. It doesn't make any sense to think that that's the meaning, if that's the meaning of the story. I'm just making it up as well. We are today. So that's one of the criticisms that Godelier makes of Lévi-Strauss. And then myths are thoughts expressed in different languages, but they are not thinking subjects. They can neither operate in men's minds nor reflect upon themselves. Lévi-Strauss says that it's not the storyteller that is making the myth do this. The storyteller doesn't know or doesn't think that, oh, I'm going to tell a story about how we should rely on the village. The storyteller just tells the story. The logic of the story, Lévi-Strauss says, the story thinks for itself. How can that be? How can the structure of a story be the thinking subject? Godelier is very rational. You can only have human thought. You can't have just thought operating language by itself. Okay, I've got a couple of bits. Does anyone know who Lévi-Strauss is talking to in the picture? Lévi-Strauss talking to Sarkozy, ex-president, ex-prime minister of France. A physicist may as well say the waves and particles that make up light are operating in his mind and reflecting upon themselves. Can myths think themselves? No. Do things think? Does this thing think? It seems like this thing thinks. It keeps on calling to us. Hey, you've neglected me. You haven't talked to me for 5 minutes. Please pick me up. But do things think? They think through us. Do they think through us abstractly? No. It's therefore reasonable to posit that it's indeed men and not gods who invent myth. But not all men invent them. Some do. Those who seek to explain themselves and to others why the world and society are the way they are, and what needs to be done so that things may be reproduced for the benefit of humans. Yes, this story explains the way things are and why and how, in fact, how to fight China in this story. I'm sure the Chinese have got stories that explain how to fight Vietnam, right? Every culture will have stories, it tells itself so that it can do things. We keep on telling ourselves that, you know, I don't know, getting an education is a good thing, that's how you'll get a job. But what it really does is reinforce a class system and a hierarchy. Anyway, by the by, that's a different course. Not everyone makes up these stories, but the stories do tell something for everyone. And actually, if you think of later, after structuralism, there came post-structuralism. Some of the structuralists are in both camps. Post-structuralism started to think that it doesn't matter who's writing the story. The author isn't really the best person to tell you what the story means. That's from Roland Barthes or Michel Foucault. They were lovers, so they said the same thing sometimes. The focus is that the story has discursive effects, but you need not trust the author to be the one who tells you the real meaning or the most important meanings of the story. It's what the story means to the audience. Think how useful that can be. If we think about then how we read, I don't know, stories of Karl Marx. Karl Marx was 200 years ago. He was born more than 200 years ago now. His book Capital, more than 150 years old. But we read it today, and he would not necessarily comprehend how we use that book or what its meaning is to us. But we read it as meaningful because we bring meaning. He's not the best person to interpret what it is, although he seems better than most. Godelier wants to say another set of relations are missing in Lévi-Strauss's work. Lévi-Strauss has not focused upon the strategic component of the economic infrastructure of a society. Who is telling the myth? It really matters who they are working for. This myth, as we've read it, will mean different things if it's told at the lowest level of society or if it's told at the government level. So the question of social relations that determine the rights of groups and individuals that make up society, control, exploit, or cause to exploit for their own benefit the elements of nature that are in operation. So in this story, what are the elements of nature that are in operation? The resources that are the village, the resources that are the state. The person who tells this story will tell it in certain ways to emphasize certain things. Do you think that Lévi-Strauss, for all of his effort in telling the stories of the South American and North American Indians, have really understood the meanings of these stories for this man? We are looking into his eyes, however many years, 70 years after he was photographed. I mean, from his eyes, you can see he has something is going on in his thinking, but we can't tell what it is. He might be thinking about writing. He might be thinking about the myths. He might be thinking about Snow White. Who knows? That expression. You can't project. You can't justify your projection onto other people. But Cordelia still wants to appreciate the work that Lévi-Strauss had done. On the whole, reading the mythology series, we're left with the impression that Lévi-Strauss presents Amerindian myths as a product of the human mind in its savage state, its wild state, right? La pensée sauvage. In touch with a still largely undomesticated nature, whereas today we know that the multiplication of the buffalo, which blackened the plains of North America, was the result of the disappearance after the arrival of European settlers of hundreds of Indian villages and groups that had practiced agriculture and carefully managed the wild herds. So Cordelia is saying there's a fantasy, Orientalist, exoticist fantasy, even in operation, by excluding the economic story of the history of those people. He didn't bring that into how the myths told about the buffalo. We know that the immense Amazonian forest, once a symbol of pristine nature, was partly the work of humans. Anthropologists subsequently have studied how the Bororo and the Nambikwara were custodians of the forest in some way, how they helped create the forest and maintain it. That's why totemism was important as an ecological story, as ecological thinking. Because if you have totemism, you are responsible for the kookaburra. You're responsible for the goanna. You're responsible for the kangaroo. And that keeps society in a balance and the ecology in a balance. If you don't pay attention to the kangaroo, that will imbalance society and we will have a disaster. And in fact, now we do have a disaster. We don't have enough goannas. We have too many kangaroos. We have to shoot them. Anyway, luckily they're delicious. Okay. Do you have any questions? Question about Lévi-Strauss? Or a question in general? Yes, I'll stop the recording and then we can do this.